In the shadow of Ridgewood snow-covered mountains, homeless veteran mechanic Mason Rivers trudged through a blizzard to rescue the stranded Harrington family when their luxury SUV failed on treacherous Eagles Bend. Using only makeshift tools and decades of engineering genius, this weathered man with calloused hands performed what experts later deemed impossible repairs in life-threatening conditions, refusing all payment from the powerful CEO of Harrington Industries. What began as a roadside rescue evolved into an extraordinary journey as the family, stunned by Mason's dignity and expertise, invited him to shelter in their vacation home, never imagining how this chance encounter would transform their perspectives on privilege. Reveal Mason's remarkable past, reconnect him with his estranged children, and ultimately establish a groundbreaking program for homeless veterans that would change countless lives across the community. This is the story of how a man who had lost everything except his knowledge and integrity became the unlikely catalyst for healing that extended far beyond broken engines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across Eagles Bend, driving snow horizontally through the darkness as Victoria Harrington gripped the steering wheel of her luxury SUV. The headlights barely penetrated the whiteout conditions, ahead illuminating only a few feet of the treacherous mountain road. "We should have stayed in Summerfield," Ethan said from the passenger seat, his voice tight with worry. "The weather service warned about this storm." Victoria's jaw clenched. "We'll be fine, the cabin's only another 20 minutes away." In the back seat, their daughter Eliza peered anxiously through the window while her brother Trevor scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the tension. "No signal," Trevor announced, finally looking up. "We're completely cut off up here." A sudden grinding noise erupted from beneath the hood, followed by a series of alarming clanks. The SUV shuddered, losing power. "What's happening?" Eliza asked, leaning forward. Victoria guided the failing vehicle toward the shoulder as the engine sputtered and died. She turned the key repeatedly, but nothing happened except a dull click. "Perfect," she muttered, releasing a frustrated sigh. "Just perfect." The Harrington family sat in stunned silence as the reality of their situation settled in. Outside, the temperature was plummeting. Inside, the warmth would last only as long as they conserved the battery. "I'll check the engine," Ethan offered, reaching for the door. "Dad, you don't know anything about engines," Trevor said, the edge in his voice betraying his fear. "I know enough to see if there's something obvious," Ethan replied, pulling his coat tighter before stepping into the storm. Victoria watched her husband disappear into the swirling snow, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. As CEO of Harrington Industries, she managed crises daily, but those were predictable business problems. This was different. This was survival. Ethan returned minutes later, snow-coating his expensive coat, his face red from the bitter cold. "It's no use, I can't even identify what's wrong," he admitted, shutting the door against the howling wind. "And there's no way a tow truck could reach us in this, so we're trapped," Trevor said, no longer hiding his concern. Eliza pulled her scarf tighter. "We should conserve heat, running the engine intermittently. Well, the engine won't start." Eliza, Victoria snapped immediately, regretting her tone. "I'm sorry, you're right about conserving what we have." As darkness deepened and the temperature dropped further, the family huddled together in the back seat, sharing blankets from the emergency kit. Each breath formed clouds in the increasingly cold interior. "We need to consider our options," Victoria said, her business mind clicking into action. "If no one comes by morning, one of us will need to hike down to find help that's at least 8 mi in snowdrifts," Ethan protested. "It would be suicide." A distant light caught Eliza's attention. "Look," she pointed through the rear window. The faint glow bobbed slowly toward them through the curtain of snow. "It's moving too slowly to be a vehicle," Ethan said, squinting to see better. Minutes passed as they watched the light grow gradually brighter until a silhouette emerged from the blizzard, a tall figure trudging through knee-deep snow. A lantern held high in one hand, beside the person trotted what appeared to be a dog. "Should we be worried?" Trevor whispered. Victoria reached for the emergency roadside kit, which contained a small flare gun. "Let's be cautious." The figure approached the driver's side, and Victoria lowered the window just enough to communicate. The blast of cold air made everyone flinch. "Car trouble," a deep, weathered Voice asked. The lantern illuminated a man's face mid-60s, with a salt and pepper beard and deep lines etched around alert blue eyes. Despite the ragged appearance of his layered clothing, his gaze was clear and intelligent. "Our engine died." "Victoria," replied wearily. "We're from Summerfield heading to our cabin." The man nodded, snowflakes clinging to his beard. "Bad night to be stranded on Eagles Bend." Name's Mason. "This here's Charlie." He gestured to the mixed breed dog sitting patiently in the snow beside him. "Do you live nearby?" Ethan asked hopefully. Brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. "I know the area, mind, if I take a look under the hood." Victoria exchanged glances with Ethan. Their options were limited. "Please," she finally said, popping the hood release. Mason moved to the front of the vehicle, setting his lantern on the edge of the engine compartment. Charlie stayed by his side, surprisingly calm amidst the howling wind. The family watched as Mason's hands moved methodically through the engine, checking connections with practiced efficiency. "He seems to know what he's doing," Eliza whispered. Trevor snorted quietly. "Or he's stealing parts." "Trevor," Eliza hissed after several minutes. Mason returned to the window, snow crusting his eyebrows. "Fuel pump's gone and there's damage to the timing belt. Must have hit something." "Under the snow." "Can it be fixed?" Victoria asked. "Not properly, not here," Mason replied frankly. "But I might be able to get you moving enough to reach shelter. Got any tools?" Victoria pointed to the small roadside kit in the trunk. Mason retrieved it, examining the basic tools with a slight frown. "Not ideal, but I've worked with less." He murmured more to himself than to them. "I'll need something from my pack." They watched as he rummaged through a weathered backpack, producing several odd items that looked handmade for over an hour. The Harringtons remained in tense silence. As Mason worked under the hood, his hands moving with surprising dexterity despite the numbing cold occasionally, he would speak softly to Charlie, who remained vigilant beside him. How does someone with such obvious mechanical knowledge end up wandering around a mountain during a blizzard? Victoria wondered aloud, careful to keep her voice low. Maybe he works somewhere nearby. Ethan suggested without conviction. Eliza's expression remained thoughtful. "His clothes are layered for survival, not just warmth. And did you notice his boots? They're military issue, but worn for years." The hood finally closed with a decisive thunk, and Mason appeared at the window again, his face red from cold, but his eyes bright with accomplishment. "Try it." Now he instructed, brushing snow from his beard. Victoria slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, with a sound that wasn't quite right but was unmistakably functional. "That's incredible, Ethan," breathed genuine amazement in his voice. "It's a temporary fix." Mason cautioned, having to raise his voice over the wind, timing still off, and the fuel pumps barely hanging on. "You've got maybe 10 mir before it fails again. Our cabin is only 7 mir down." "The mountain," Victoria said, relief evident in her voice. "We can't thank you enough. Please let us pay you for your help." Mason shook his head, already stepping back from the vehicle. "No need, at least." "Let us give you a ride," Eliza called out. "It's freezing out there. We're headed the same direction anyway," Mason conceded after a moment's consideration. "Charlie and I could use a break from this wind." Trevor reluctantly moved to the middle seat as Mason carefully helped Charlie into the back before climbing in himself. The dog settled quietly at his feet, well trained despite his rough appearance. The SUV moved slowly down Eagles Bend, the engine making concerning noises but holding together as promised inside. The awkward silence was broken only by Mason occasionally giving directions at forks in the road. "So do you work as a mechanic locally?" Ethan finally asked, attempting conversation. "Used to be an engineer." Mason replied simply, "Military, then private sector, and now." Victoria prompted, watching him in the rearview mirror. Mason's eyes met hers briefly. "Now I get," by the simple dignity in his voice silenced further questions. Eliza, however, noticed details the others missed. The careful way Mason had stowed his few possessions, how he'd given Charlie a small portion of something from his pocket before eating a bit himself. The military precision in his movements. When they reached a fork in the road, Mason pointed to the right. "Your cabin should be 2 mir down that way. I'll get out here." "Nonsense." Victoria said firmly. The temperature is well below freezing and that storm is getting worse. The least we can offer is a warm meal and shelter for the night. That's very kind. But Mason began. I insist, Victoria interrupted, using the same tone. That closed million-dollar deals you saved us from a potentially deadly situation one night in a warm cabin is hardly adequate compensation. Mason studied her for a moment, then glanced down at Charlie, who looked up at him with trusting eyes. The old dog was shivering slightly despite his thick fur. One night Mason agreed quietly for Charlie's sake. The Harrington cabin came into view, a rustic retreat that was actually a 4 square FT luxury home with panoramic windows and a massive stone fireplace. As Victoria pulled into the covered driveway, the engine gave one final protesting groan before dying completely. Perfect timing, Ethan remarked, impressed again by Mason's assessment. Inside, the cabin's emergency generator had kept the heat on, and soon a fire roared in the massive stone fireplace. Mason stood awkwardly in the entryway, suddenly aware of his ragged appearance in such opulent surroundings. Charlie sat obediently at his side, equally out of place on the polished hardwood floors. Please make yourself comfortable, Victoria said, gesturing toward the great room. I'll prepare something hot to eat. As the family bustled about, Mason remained standing, his weathered hands clasped before him, eyes taking in details with careful precision. On the mantelpiece, framed family photos showed the Harringtons at various vacation destinations, sailing in the Caribbean, skiing in the Alps, standing before ancient ruins. You can set your things there, Eliza said gently, pointing to a bench by the door, and I'll get some towels for Charlie. Mason nodded his thanks, carefully removing his outer layers. Beneath the tattered coat was a faded but meticulously clean flannel shirt. From his pack he removed a small tin bowl which he filled with water for Charlie from his own canteen, before accepting anything for himself. Trevor watched this ritual from across the room, his expression a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. When Mason caught him staring, the young man quickly looked away, busying himself with his phone. Now that it had signal again in the kitchen, Victoria prepared a simple but hearty soup, moving with the efficiency of someone unaccustomed to being idle even in domestic tasks. What do you make of him? She asked Ethan in hushed tones. He's obviously homeless, Ethan replied quietly, but there's something else there. The way he fixed the car wasn't just skill, that was expertise. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, watching as Eliza sat near Mason, speaking to him with the natural as she showed with clients. At the social services office where she worked either way, Victoria decided, we'll feed him tonight, offer him the guest room, and drive him wherever he needs to go in the morning when the roads are clearer. Little did the Harrington family realize that the storm outside was nowhere near as powerful as the one that had been raging through Mason River's life for years, or that their paths crossing on this frigid mountain pass would forever alter the trajectory of all their lives, beginning with the revelation that would come over dinner about exactly who they had invited into their home. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Steam rose from the bowls of soup Victoria placed on the rustic dining table. The wind rattled the windows as the blizzard intensified outside, making the cabin's warmth feel even more precious. Mason sat stiffly in his chair, his posture military, straight. Despite his obvious fatigue, Charlie curled at his feet, occasionally lifting his head at interesting smells from the table. Please eat, Victoria encouraged, noting how Mason waited until everyone else had started. Thank you, Mason said simply, taking a careful spoonful. His weathered hands were clean but marked with decades-old scars and calluses, the permanent badge of someone who had worked with engines and metal for a lifetime. So Ethan began conversationally. You mentioned you were a military engineer. What branch? Army Corps of Engineers. Mason replied, his voice gaining a hint of pride. 22 years. Trevor, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up with sudden interest. You were career military. Mason nodded. Started as a mechanic, advanced to engineering specialized vehicles and field equipment. That explains how you fix our SUV with practically nothing, Victoria observed. I've had professional mechanics tell me certain repairs are impossible without specialized equipment, yet you managed with makeshift tools in a blizzard. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. Most mechanics these days are trained, To replace in parts, not understand systems when you understand how things work at a fundamental level. You can improvise, like MacGyver, Trevor said with a smirk. More like necessity. Mason counted evenly in combat zones you can't always wait for. The right part, people's lives depend on getting equipment running again. Eliza stirred her soup thoughtfully. Where were you stationed all over Germany? Korea, 2 tours in Iraq, Afghanistan. Mason's eyes took on a distant look. Finished my service. As a master sergeant overseeing emergency field repairs, Victoria's business instincts tingled. This man wasn't just some random drifter. His speech was educated, his technical knowledge exceptional, and his bearing, unmistakably that of someone who had once held significant responsibility. And after the military, she probed gently. Mason's expression closed. Slightly. Worked for Bradford Automotive Engineering for 8 years. We developed specialized transport systems. He took another spoonful of soup, signaling his reluctance to elaborate. Trevor nearly choked on his bread. Bradford Automotive. They designed custom systems for military vehicles. Their engineers are like elite. Mason said nothing, but his silence confirmed Trevor's statement. The family exchanged glances, the disconnect between Mason's obvious expertise and current circumstances becoming more puzzling. Ethan, ever diplomatic, steered the conversation to safer ground. This cabin has been in Victoria's family for generations. We try to visit a few times each year, though. Work makes it difficult. It's beautiful craftsmanship. Mason noted, eyes tracing the exposed beams. You don't see hand-honeyed joinery like that anymore. The meal continued with superficial conversation, but the questions about Mason's past hung in the air. As Victoria cleared the dishes, Eliza helped, while the men moved to the great room where Ethan stoked the fire. I should check your vehicle, Mason said, reaching for his coat. Make sure it's secure for the night. I'll join you, Trevor offered unexpectedly. Could use some fresh air. Outside, the storm had momentarily calmed, though snow still fell heavily. Mason examined the SUV's engine again, securing loose connections he'd made during his emergency repair. So how does someone with your background end up? Trevor trailed off, unsure how to phrase his question tactfully. Mason glanced at him, then returned to the engine. End up homeless? He finished matter-of-factly. Life happens, son, sometimes all at once. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. Mason interrupted without malice. It's a fair question. He closed the hood with practiced precision. My wife Margaret died of cancer 6 years ago. Medical bills took everything, even with insurance. Then PTSD from my combat tours caught up with me. Lost my job. My house, tried VA programs. But he shrugged, the gesture containing volumes of unspoken frustration. Trevor stood silent, the privilege of his life suddenly stark against Mason's reality. Most people are one catastrophe away from where I am. Mason added quietly. Just some have further to fall than others inside the cabin. Victoria and Eliza had a similar conversation while preparing coffee. He's clearly educated and skilled. Victoria observed, it doesn't make sense. Eliza gave her mother a knowing look. It makes perfect sense if you've worked with veterans like I have. The system fails them. Constantly add personal tragedy, and it's a recipe for downward spiral regardless of your credentials. Victoria frowned, her orderly worldview challenged in business. She believed outcomes were directly tied to ability and effort. Mason's situation contradicted this comfortable assumption when Mason and Trevor returned. The awkwardness had evaporated, somewhat replaced by a tentative respect. Charlie, who had been dozing by the fire, perked up at his master's return. Ethan served coffee in the sitting area where the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the rustic furniture outside. The storm intensified again. Wind howling around the eaves. We're fortunate you found us when you did. Ethan commented, what brought you out in? Such conditions. Mason cradled his mug in both hands, savoring the warmth. I've been doing odd jobs around Ridgewood, was heading to the church shelter when the storm worsened. Saw your headlights from the ridge path you live in. Ridgewood, Eliza asked. Mason's eyes met hers with unflinching honesty. I move between towns in the area, libraries during the day, shelters when available, wooded areas when not. The Grove. Eliza said with sudden understanding. There's a homeless encampment there. The Social services office where I work has been trying to connect with residents, but most avoid official contact with good reason. Mason replied, most services come with conditions that don't account for reality. Charlie here isn't allowed in shelters. For instance, he scratched behind the dog's ears. He's all the family I've left, not leaving him outside in winter. Victoria listened intently, her analytical mind processing this information against her preconceptions as CEO. She prided herself on understanding systems and solving problems efficiently. The complexity of homelessness that someone with Mason's obvious capabilities could fall through, society's cracks challenged her worldview. You mentioned a wife, she said carefully. Do you have children? A shadow crossed Mason's face. Son and daughter, Jack and Emma. We're estranged. They tried to help after Margaret died, but I wasn't in a place to accept it, said some unforgivable things. His voice grew rough. Pride's a dangerous thing when it's all you have left. The confession hung in the air, weighted with regret. Even Trevor seemed affected, his usual detachment replaced by genuine attention. It's never too late to rebuild connections, Eliza offered gently. In my work, I've seen families reconcile after decades. Mason smiled faintly, perhaps, but first I'd need something to offer. Besides apologies, they deserve better than a father they have to worry about or be ashamed of. Thunder cracked, overhead startlingly close, and the lights flickered ominously. Seconds later, the power failed, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the fireplace glow. Generator should kick in, Ethan said, reaching for his phone flashlight after several seconds of silence. Victoria sighed. Unless the storm damaged the connection. It's happened before. Mason rose smoothly, retrieving his lantern from his pack. I can take a look if you'd like. Where's the generator? Housed in a shed behind the cabin, Ethan replied. But maybe we should wait until morning. It's treacherous out there. Fire will keep the main room warm, Mason said practically, but your pipes could freeze without heat in the outer rooms. Best to address it now. Victoria noted how quickly he assessed the practical implications, another glimpse of the capable man beneath the weathered exterior. The maintenance tools should be in the shed as well, she said. Mason nodded already, pulling on his coat. I'll need someone to hold the light. Too dark to manage alone. I'll go, Trevor volunteered. Surprising everyone, including himself, outside the full fury of the storm had returned. Trevor struggled to maintain his footing as they trudged through knee-deep snow to the generator shed. Mason moved with practiced efficiency, seemingly unbothered by the biting cold. The shed door required both men's effort to push open against the drifting snow. Inside, the generator sat silent, covered in a light coating of frost from the imperfect seals around the shed windows. Hold the light here, Mason instructed, immediately identifying the issue. Connections frozen, and there's damage to the fuel line. Trevor watched in fascination as Mason dissected the problem, explaining each component and its function, while he worked. Despite the cold numbing his fingers, Mason's hands remained steady, methodically addressing each issue. How do you know all this? Trevor asked, genuinely curious. Mason glanced up briefly. Necessity. When you live outdoors, you learn to fix things with whatever's available. Skills transfer across most mechanical systems. They're just variations on basic principles, but you could be making serious money with these skills, Trevor persisted. Any garage would hire you instantly. Mason's hands paused momentarily. It's not that simple. No fixed address, no phone gaps in employment history. Most employers see those red flags and stopped looking deeper. He reconnected. A crucial wire besides formal employment requires stability. I haven't had, but before at Bradford you must have been successful. I was. Mason acknowledged, his voice neutral. Had a nice house, 2 cars, retirement plan. Appearances matter in the corporate world. After Margaret got sick, everything went to treatments when she died anyway. He trailed off, focusing on a damaged gasket. The grief was overwhelming. Started having flashbacks from combat tours. I thought I'd processed. Couldn't sleep. Made mistakes. At work? Classic downward spiral. The generator suddenly hummed to life, lights flickering on in the cabin, visible through the shed windows there. Mason said with satisfaction. Should hold through the night, but the fuel line needs proper replacement. Soon as they made their way back to the cabin, Trevor found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about homelessness. His business classes had reduced such problems to statistics and policies. never individual stories like Mason's inside. Warmth greeted them as the heating system reactivated Victoria, and Ethan listened with evident surprise as Trevor enthusiastically recounted Mason's methodical repair of the generator. He explained everything so clearly. Trevor finished. I actually understand how generators work now. Mason accepted their thanks with slight embarrassment. The evening continued more comfortably with Eliza discovering a chess set and challenging Mason to a game. His strategic approach revealed yet another dimension to his intelligence, though he downplayed his skills as the night deepened. Ethan showed Mason to the guest room, a space larger and more comfortable than anywhere he'd slept in years. Charlie circled 3 times on the rug before settling with a contented sigh. There are clean towels in the bathroom, Ethan explained, and I've left some clothes that might fit. They're just casual things we keep here for hiking. Mason nodded his thanks, clearly uncomfortable with the generosity, but too practical to refuse. Once alone, he sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the crisp sheets with a mixture of appreciation and discomfort on the nightstand. A family photo showed the Harringtons laughing together on a beach. Mason studied their faces, the easy happiness of people whose worst problems were manageable, whose futures were secure. He moved to the window, watching the relentless snow transform the landscape. 6 years of nomadic existence had trained him to accept temporary shelter without attachment, knowing morning would bring a return to survival mode. Yet something about this evening had awakened dormant feelings, not envy for the Harringtons' wealth, but longing for the connection they shared. Charlie weighed softly, sensing his master's unease. It's all right, boy, Mason murmured, kneeling to stroke the dog's graying muzzle. Just for tonight. Tomorrow we move on like always. But as he finally stretched out on the bed, his body surrendering to comfort, it had forgotten Mason couldn't silence the whisper in his mind that something fundamental had shifted, that the Harrington family, with their curious questions and unexpected respect, had seen him in a way he hadn't been seen in years, not as a homeless veteran or a charity case, but as a man with value, with knowledge, with a story worth hearing. In the hallway, Victoria paused outside the guest room, a strange protective instinct having drawn her to check on their unexpected guest. From inside came the soft, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. She continued to the main bedroom where Ethan was already under the covers, scrolling through emails on his tablet. Our guest settled in? He asked. Victoria nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what he said, about systems versus parts. The mechanic philosophy. Ethan set his tablet aside. What about it? It applies to people too, she said quietly. We look at someone like Mason and see a broken part, homelessness, without understanding the entire system that led there. Ethan studied his wife's face, recognizing the expression she wore when formulating a new business strategy. What are you thinking, Victoria? I'm not sure yet, she admitted. But I know we can't just send him back to the Grove tomorrow and pretend this evening never happened outside. The storm began to when the wind's howl, softening to an occasional moan. But within the cabin, seeds of change had been planted that would grow far beyond this single night of shelter, beginning with the unexpected crisis that would greet them at sunrise. Dawn brought clarity to the landscape, pristine snow blanketing everything in sight, trees heavy with white burden, and the mountain pass below completely impossible. It also brought the sound of labored, wheezing coughs from the guest room. Eliza heard it first as she prepared coffee. Her social worker instincts immediately on alert, she knocked softly on Mason's door, receiving only Charlie's concerned whine in response. Mason, she called, opening the door cautiously. Inside, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his face alarmingly pale beneath his weathered tan, his breathing shallow and painful. Charlie paced anxiously beside him. I'm fine, Mason managed unconvincingly. Just need a minute. Eliza's trained eye recognized the signs immediately. The bluish tinge to his lips, the way he hunched to minimize chest movement, the slight tremor in his hands. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. You're burning up, she said, already reaching for her phone. Mom, Dad. Victoria appeared in the doorway seconds later, her hair still tousled from sleep, but her eyes instantly alert. She assessed the situation with the same efficiency she applied to business crisis. What's happening? Possible pneumonia. Eliza replied he needs medical attention. Mason tried to stand, swaying dangerously. Just need to warm up, I'll be on my way. His legs buckled, and only Victoria's quick reflexes prevented him from collapsing completely. She and Eliza guided him back to the bed. You're not going anywhere, Victoria stated firmly. Ethan, call Valley View Medical Center, ask about emergency transport. Ethan appeared with his phone already to his ear. Lines are down, storm damaged the cell towers. Trevor joined them, eyes widening at Mason's condition. The internet's out too, were completely cut off. Victoria's mind raced through options, her decision-making process operating at peak efficiency. Trevor, check our SUV, see if Mason's repairs might get us down the mountain. Trevor disappeared, returning minutes later with a grim expression. No chance, engines completely seized now. Mason's coughing intensified, each spasm causing him visible pain. Got medicine in my pack, he wheezed. Eliza quickly located a prescription bottle with only 3 tablets, remaining antibiotics with a date from 4 months earlier. When did these symptoms start? She asked, offering him water with the remaining medicine. Couple days. Mason admitted, reluctantly, thought I could push through. Victoria pinched the bridge of her nose, recognizing the stubbornness that reflected her own tendency to ignore physical limitations. That's why you were heading to the church, you needed shelter to recover. Mason nodded weakly, his usual dignity betrayed by the involuntary shudder that ran through his body. He needs a doctor. Eliza insisted, his oxygen levels are dropping. I can see it in his coloration. Victoria surveyed the room, her gaze falling on Mason's meticulously organized pack. Despite his illness, he'd arranged his few possessions with military precision. Everything essential, nothing wasted. The discipline spoke volumes. Ethan, the emergency satellite phone in the basement storage, she directed. It should still work. While Ethan retrieved the phone, Victoria instructed Trevor to stoke the fire and Eliza to gather blankets. She remained beside Mason, her hand instinctively moving to check his pulse, strong but rapid. Sorry. Mason murmured, genuine remorse in his feverish eyes. Don't mean to be a burden. Stop that, Victoria replied with surprising gentleness. You saved our lives last night. A little reciprocal help hardly constitutes a burden. Charlie would softly, resting his muzzle on the bed near Mason's hand. The dog's obvious concern touched Victoria unexpectedly. Ethan returned with the satellite phone already dialing after a tense conversation. His expression confirmed what they feared. Emergency services can't get through. The pass is completely blocked by avalanche risk, they're saying at least 24 hours. Before helicopter evacuation is possible if his condition is stable. Victoria watched Mason's labored breathing. He might not have 24 hours. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Mason's wheezing and Charlie's occasional anxious whimper. There might be another option, Trevor said suddenly. The radio in Dad's study, it's connected to the emergency response network. We might reach someone closer. Victoria nodded sharply. Try it. As Trevor and Ethan left to attempt radio contact, Eliza administered the last of Mason's antibiotics and began cooling his forehead with a damp cloth. Victoria found herself studying the contents of his pack that Eliza had moved aside, a carefully maintained journal with precise handwriting, a small toolkit with custom modifications, a battered photograph in a handmade frame showing a younger Mason with a woman, and 2 teenagers, Margaret and the kids. Mason explained, catching her gaze. Jack and Emma, taken at Emma's high school graduation. Victoria brought him the photo. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced their faces. Jack works for an architectural firm in Denver now, he continued, his voice weak but determined. Emma's a teacher in Portland, good kids, better than I deserved. Have you contacted them recently? Victoria asked. Mason's eyes clouded. Not for years. Better that way, they've built lives without the disappointment of watching their father. He trailed off, overcome by another coughing fit in the study. Trevor and Ethan worked methodically through radio frequencies, finally connecting with a volunteer fire station in a neighboring valley. The news wasn't good. All emergency vehicles were addressing multiple crises from the storm. Wait, Trevor said, suddenly an idea forming. Ask if they can reach Alpine Mechanics in Ridgewood. There's a mechanic there. Hank Wilson say. It's about Mason Rivers. Ethan raised an eyebrow but relayed the message. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled to life again. "This is Hank Wilson. You've got Mason up there." "Is he?" "Okay, Trevor took the microphone. He's sick, pneumonia. Probably we're stranded and can't get him to a hospital." A pause. "Then Mason's a proud man. Must be bad if he admitted needing help." "He didn't." Trevor replied. "He collapsed after helping us during the storm." "Do you know him well?" "Known him for years." Hank confirmed. "He does occasional work at my shop when I'm backlogged." "Best damn mechanic I've ever seen." Even with limited tools, the radio crackled with static. "Look, I've got a modified snowmobile that can handle those conditions. Give me your coordinates," as Ethan provided their location. Trevor felt an unexpected surge of respect for Mason even in his present circumstances. He'd maintained connections and earned professional admiration back in the guest room. Mason's condition was deteriorating. His breathing had become more labored, and the fever refused to break. Despite Eliza's best efforts, Victoria had taken over the cooling compresses, moving with uncharacteristic tenderness. "You mentioned Bradford Automotive," she said, trying to keep him engaged and conscious. "I remember when they developed the adaptive suspension system for military vehicles. Revolutionary work." A ghost of pride flickered in Mason's eyes. "Led that project," he murmured. 18 patents in my name. Their system saved lives in Afghanistan. Vehicles could take hits and keep moving." Victoria's corporate mind calculated rapidly. 18 patents at a company like Bradford would have made him a significant asset, probably with substantial compensation. The contrast with his current situation was jarring. "Those patents?" she probed gently. "Do you still hold interest in them?" Mason's laugh turned into a painful cough. "Sold everything during Margaret's treatment. Experimental therapies insurance wouldn't cover, worth every penny for 6 more months with her." The simple declaration silenced Victoria in her world of strategic business decisions. Such choices were rarely so clear-cut or poignant. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Hank Wilson is on his way with medical supplies. ETA 3 hours if the weather holds." Mason's eyes closed briefly in what might have been relief or resignation. "Good man. Hank gave me work when others wouldn't," as his strength ebbed. Mason's usual barriers lowered. He spoke and disconnected. Fragments about his military service, engineering challenges. He'd solved his wife's garden that bloomed, despite the mountain climate, teaching his children to rebuild their first engine. Each story revealed another layer of the accomplished, loving man, now reduced to surviving one day at a time. Charlie maintained his vigilant position by the bed, occasionally nudging Mason's hand when his voice grew too faint, as if encouraging him to continue. "Your dog is remarkably well trained," Victoria observed, hoping to keep Mason talking. "A faint smile, service animal. Technically helps with the PTSD senses episodes." Before they hit his hand, rested weakly on Charlie's head. "Kept me alive more than once when the memories got too loud." The revelation added another dimension to Mason's refusal to abandon Charlie for shelter access. The dog wasn't just companionship, but a vital lifeline to his mental health. Trevor and Eliza prepared the cabin for Hank's arrival, clearing the driveway as best they could and gathering supplies to stabilize Mason for transport. Working together, the siblings found unexpected common ground. "I never understood your work before," Trevor admitted as they shoveled snow. "The social services cases you talk about seemed abstract." Eliza paused, leaning on her shovel. "That's the problem with homelessness in America. We make it abstract. Statistics, policies, budgets, never. The human faces, the individual stories." She gestured toward the cabin. Mason could be teaching engineering at a university or heading a technical department. Instead, he's fighting for basic survival because of circumstances most people couldn't handle any better than he did. Trevor nodded thoughtfully. "In business school, they teach us about risk management and insurance. None of it accounts for the kind of catastrophic coincidence that hit him. Medical bankruptcy and PTSD simultaneously." Inside, Victoria had moved a comfortable chair beside Mason's bed, reviewing work emails on her tablet, but looking up frequently to check his condition. The fever had plateaued, not worsening, but stubbornly persistent. "You don't need to stay," Mason said during a moment of clarity. "I'll be fine." Victoria set her tablet aside. "I have 3 meetings rescheduled, and a board presentation delayed because of this storm. Might as well make myself useful here." Mason studied her with Surprising perception. Despite his illness, you don't like feeling helpless any more than I do. The observation, so accurate and directly stated, caught Victoria off guard. Few people in her professional circle would have dared such personal insight. No, she admitted. I don't control as an illusion, Mason said softly. Took me years to learn that military teaches you discipline, precision mastery. Engineering reinforces the belief that every problem has a solution. His eyes drifted to the photograph of his family. But some things can't be fixed no matter how skilled you are. Victoria followed his gaze to the picture. Your children might surprise your family. Connections are remarkably resilient. Mason's response was interrupted by a distant mechanical growl growing steadily louder. Ethan rushed into the room. Hank's here and he's brought someone from the hospital. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Hank Wilson, a burly man in his 50s with a mechanic's practical demeanor, arrived with Nurse Joy Patterson from Valley View Medical Center. She immediately established an IV for fluids and antibiotics, her efficiency matching Victoria's in a different sphere. Pneumonia for sure, Joy confirmed after her examination. But we've caught it before sepsis set in. These antibiotics should stabilize him enough for transport. When the roads clear throughout the assessment, Hank hovered nearby, his gruff exterior barely concealing genuine concern when the medical necessities were addressed. He approached Mason's bedside. You old fool, he said with rough affection. When I said stop by the shop this week, I didn't mean bring the whole Harrington family with you despite his weakness. Mason managed a smile, dramatic as always. Hank, you know these people? Victoria asked, gesturing to the Harringtons. Hank nodded. Harrington Industries, everybody in the region knows them. He turned to Victoria. Your company's manufacturing plant over in Summerfield employs half the county. Victoria processed this unexpected connection. You've never mentioned working with Mason at the shop, she said to Hank. Why would I? Besides, Mason's particular about his privacy. Hank glanced at his friend. Does odd jobs all over town. Fixes Mrs. Sullivan's ancient refrigerator at the hardware store, tunes up Sheriff Davis's cruiser when the department budget runs low. Reconstructed the heating system at St. Thomas Church last winter. When it failed, each revelation painted a picture, not of an isolated homeless man, but of someone deeply woven into the community fabric. Despite his circumstances, contributing specialized skills to people who valued his expertise, if not his social status as nurse. Patterson continued tending to Mason. The Harringtons gathered in the kitchen with Hank, who provided additional context to Mason's situation. Most folks around here know his story, Hank explained, accepting the coffee Eliza offered. He never asks for handouts, just work. Pride's his biggest problem. Won't accept help unless he's earned it. He mentioned working at your garage. Trevor said, why not hire him permanently? Hank sighed. Tried. He refuses, says he can't commit to regular hours when the PTSD flares up, doesn't want to let me down. Hank's weather-beaten face softened. Truth is, he's better with engines than anyone I've ever met, including myself, could work half-time and still be my most valuable employee. What about housing? Eliza asked. Surely someone in town offered him my garage apartment last winter. Hank interrupted. Wouldn't take it. Says accepting housing would create obligation he can't guarantee he'll meet. He shook his head, stubborn as they come, rather sleep rough with his dignity than risk disappointing someone who's counting on him. Victoria listened intently, her analytical mind processing this information against her growing understanding of Mason's character. What had initially seemed like simple homelessness was revealing itself as a complex web of PTSD, pride, and self-imposed isolation born of past trauma. His children, she said. Suddenly, have you met them? Hank nodded. Jack came looking for him about 2 years ago. Mason avoided him, had me say he'd moved on. Broke my heart to lie. But Mason was adamant, said Jack had a good career started and didn't need his father's baggage. Holding him back in the guest room, Mason had finally fallen into a more restful sleep. The antibiotics beginning their work, Charlie maintained his vigilant position, occasionally accepting gentle pats from Nurse Patterson. Beautiful relationship, Joy commented when Eliza checked in 20 years of nursing. I've seen how powerfully animals help with recovery. This one hasn't left his side for a second. Eliza knelt beside Charlie, scratching behind his ears. He mentioned Charlie's a service animal. For his PTSD, Joy nodded. That explains the exceptional training. These bonds are therapeutic in ways medication can't touch. Later that afternoon, the satellite phone connection was restored. The emergency dispatcher confirmed that road clearing had begun, but helicopter evacuation remained impossible due to high winds. His condition is stable, Joy reported after consulting with a doctor via phone. The immediate danger has passed, but he'll need continued treatment and monitoring. Victoria had been unusually quiet, a sign recognized by her family as deep strategic thinking. As evening approached, she finally shared her thoughts with Ethan in the privacy of their bedroom. I've been considering Mason's situation, she began carefully, not just his illness, but the whole picture. Ethan sat beside her on the bed. And it's wasteful, Victoria stated with the directness that characterized her business decisions. 18 patents at Bradford, military engineering expertise, problem-solving skills. That saved us in a crisis. All that knowledge and capability essentially lost because of a perfect storm of personal disaster and institutional failure. What are you suggesting? Ethan asked, recognizing the familiar determination in his wife's expression. Victoria's gaze was steady. I'm not sure yet, but I know we can't simply drive him back to the Grove once the road's clear and consider our obligation fulfilled. He's very proud. Ethan reminded her, he won't accept charity. Then we won't offer charity. Victoria replied simply, we'll offer opportunity. As darkness fell outside, the mountain winds quieted to an occasional whisper inside. Mason slept more peacefully, his breathing less labored, while the Harrington family began to formulate a plan that would challenge everything they thought they understood about value, dignity, and second chances. A plan that would need to navigate the complex terrain of Mason's pride while addressing the practical realities of his situation. What none of them yet realized was how this solution would eventually extend far beyond one man's circumstances to touch dozens of lives throughout the community, beginning with the unexpected visitor who would arrive once the roads cleared the following day. Morning brought a changed landscape, blinding sunlight reflecting off pristine snowplows distantly visible on the main road below, and a marked improvement in Mason's condition. The combination of antibiotics, proper rest, and nourishment had worked small wonders overnight, though still weak. His breathing came easier and lucidity had fully returned to his eyes. Nurse Patterson checked his vitals with professional efficiency. Significant improvement. She announced temperatures down, oxygen saturation up. You got lucky, Mr. Rivers. Not luck, Mason replied, his gaze moving to the Harrington family hovering nearby. Good people. Victoria stepped forward. The road should be passable by afternoon. We'll arrange transport to Valley View Medical Center for continued treatment. Mason immediately shook his head. That's unnecessary. I'm feeling much better. It's non-negotiable. Victoria counted her tone, brooking no argument. You had bacterial pneumonia. Without completion of the antibiotic course, you risk relapse or worse. Mason started to protest again, but was interrupted by a firm knock at the cabin door. Sheriff Davis stood on the porch, snow crusting his official jacket, concern evident in his weathered face. Heard Mason Rivers was up here, he said without preamble, and that statistics, policies, budgets, never. The human faces, the individual stories. She gestured toward the cabin. Mason could be teaching engineering at a university or heading a technical department. Instead, he's fighting for basic survival because of circumstances most people couldn't handle any better than he did. Trevor nodded thoughtfully. In business school, they teach us about risk management and insurance. None of it accounts for the kind of catastrophic coincidence that hit him. Medical bankruptcy and PTSD simultaneously. Inside, Victoria had moved a comfortable chair beside Mason's bed, reviewing work emails on her tablet, but looking up frequently to check his condition. The fever had plateaued, not worsening, but stubbornly persistent. You don't need to stay, Mason said during a moment of clarity. I'll be fine. Victoria set her tablet aside. I have 3 meetings rescheduled and a board presentation delayed because of this storm. Might as well make myself useful here. Mason studied her with surprising perception. Despite his illness, you don't like feeling helpless any more than I do. The observation, so accurate and directly stated, caught Victoria off guard. Few people in her professional circle would have dared such personal insight. No, she admitted. I don't control as an illusion, Mason said softly. Took me years to learn that military teaches you discipline, precision mastery. Engineering reinforces the belief that every problem has a solution. His eyes drifted to the photograph of his family. But some things can't be fixed no matter how skilled you are. Victoria followed his gaze to the picture. Your children might surprise your family. Connections are remarkably resilient. Mason's response was interrupted by a distant mechanical growl growing steadily louder. Ethan rushed into the room. Hank's here and he's brought someone from the hospital. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Hank Wilson, a burly man in his 50s with a mechanic's practical demeanor, arrived with Nurse Joy Patterson from Valley View Medical Center. She immediately established an IV for fluids and antibiotics, her efficiency matching Victoria's in a different sphere. Pneumonia for sure, Joy confirmed after her examination. But we've caught it before sepsis set in. These antibiotics should stabilize him enough for transport. When the roads clear throughout the assessment, Hank hovered nearby, his gruff exterior, barely concealing genuine concern when the medical necessities were addressed. He approached Mason's bedside. You old fool, he said with rough affection when I said stop by the shop this week. I didn't mean bring the whole Harrington family with you despite his weakness. Mason managed a smile, dramatic as always. Hank, you know these people? Victoria asked, gesturing to the Harringtons. Hank nodded. Harrington Industries, everybody in the region knows them. He turned to Victoria. Your company's manufacturing plant over in Summerfield employs half the county. Victoria processed this unexpected connection. You've never mentioned working with Mason at the shop, she said to Hank. Why would I, besides Mason's particular about his privacy? Hank glanced at his friend. Does odd jobs all over town. Fixes Mrs. Sullivan's ancient refrigerator at the hardware store, tunes up Sheriff Davis's cruiser when the department budget runs low. Reconstructed the heating system at St. Thomas Church last winter. When it failed, each revelation painted a picture, not of an isolated homeless man, but of someone deeply woven into the community fabric, despite his circumstances, contributing specialized skills to people who valued his expertise, if not his social status as nurse. Patterson continued tending to Mason. The Harringtons gathered in the kitchen with Hank, who provided additional context to Mason's situation. Most folks around here know his story, Hank explained, accepting the coffee Eliza offered. He never asks for handouts. Just work pride's his biggest problem. Won't accept help unless he's earned it. He mentioned working at your garage. Trevor said, why not hire him permanently? Hank sighed. Tried, he refuses, says he can't commit to regular hours when the PTSD flares up, doesn't want to let me down. Hank's weather-beaten face softened. Truth is, he's better with engines than anyone I've ever met, including myself, could work half-time and still be my most valuable employee. What about housing? Eliza asked. Surely someone in town offered him my garage apartment last winter. Hank interrupted. Wouldn't take it. Says accepting housing would create obligation he can't guarantee he'll meet. He shook his head, stubborn as they come, rather sleep rough with his dignity than risk disappointing someone who's counting on him. Victoria listened intently, her analytical mind processing this information against her growing understanding of Mason's character. What had initially seemed like simple homelessness was revealing itself as a complex web of PTSD, pride, and self-imposed isolation born of past trauma. His children, she said. Suddenly, have you met them? Hank nodded. Jack came looking for him about 2 years ago. Mason avoided him, had me say he'd moved on. Broke my heart to lie. But Mason was adamant, said Jack had a good career started and didn't need his father's baggage. Holding him back in the guest room, Mason had finally fallen into a more restful sleep. The antibiotics beginning their work, Charlie maintained his vigilant position, occasionally accepting gentle pats from Nurse Patterson. Beautiful relationship, Joy commented when Eliza checked in 20 years of nursing. I've seen how powerfully animals help with recovery. This one hasn't left his side for a second. Eliza knelt beside Charlie, scratching behind his ears. He mentioned Charlie's a service animal. For his PTSD, Joy nodded. That explains the exceptional training. These bonds are therapeutic in ways medication can't touch. Later that afternoon, the satellite phone connection was restored. The emergency dispatcher confirmed that road clearing had Begun, but helicopter evacuation remained impossible due to high winds. His condition is stable, Joy reported after consulting with a doctor via phone. The immediate danger has passed, but he'll need continued treatment and monitoring. Victoria had been unusually quiet, a sign recognized by her family as deep strategic thinking as evening approached. She finally shared her thoughts with Ethan in the privacy of their bedroom. I've been considering Mason's situation, she began carefully, not just his illness, but the whole picture. Ethan sat beside her on the bed, and it's wasteful, Victoria stated with the directness that characterized her business decisions. 18 patents at Bradford, military engineering expertise, problem-solving skills. That saved us in a crisis. All that knowledge and capability essentially lost because of a perfect storm of personal disaster and institutional failure. What are you suggesting? Ethan asked. Recognizing the familiar determination in his wife's expression, Victoria's gaze was steady. I'm not sure yet, but I know we can't simply drive him back to the Grove once the road's clear and consider our obligation fulfilled. He's very proud. Ethan reminded her, he won't accept charity, then we won't offer charity. Victoria replied simply, we'll offer opportunity. As darkness fell outside, the mountain winds quieted to an occasional whisper inside. Mason slept more peacefully, his breathing less labored, while the Harrington family began to formulate a plan that would challenge everything they thought they understood about value, dignity, and second chances. A plan that would need to navigate the complex terrain of Mason's pride while addressing the practical realities of his situation. What none of them yet realized was how this solution would eventually extend far beyond one man's circumstances to touch dozens of lives throughout the community, beginning with the unexpected visitor who would arrive once the roads cleared the following day. Morning brought a changed landscape, blinding sunlight reflecting off pristine snowplows distantly visible on the main road below, and a marked improvement in Mason's condition. The combination of antibiotics, proper rest, and nourishment had worked small wonders overnight, though still weak. His breathing came easier, and lucidity had fully returned to his eyes. Nurse Patterson checked his vitals with professional efficiency. Significant improvement. She announced temperatures down, oxygen saturation up. You got lucky, Mr. Rivers. Not luck, Mason replied, his gaze moving to the Harrington family hovering nearby. Good people. Victoria stepped forward. The road should be passable by afternoon. We'll arrange transport to Valley View Medical Center for continued treatment. Mason immediately shook his head. That's unnecessary. I'm feeling much better. It's non-negotiable. Victoria counted her tone. Brooking no argument. You had bacterial pneumonia. Without completion of the antibiotic course, you risk relapse or worse. Mason started to protest again, but was interrupted by a firm knock at the cabin door. Sheriff Davis stood on the porch, snow crusting his official jacket, concern evident in his weathered face. Heard Mason Rivers was up here, he said without preamble, and that remains with me. Third, that I maintain independence. No monitoring or reporting beyond what's professionally necessary. Victoria recognized these stipulations as protective measures from someone who had learned the hard way that help often came with hidden constraints. Those terms are reasonable, she replied. I would add conditions of my own completion of your medical treatment, acceptance of appropriate housing, and consideration of reconnecting with your children. Mason's expression tightened. At the last point, my relationship with my children is not open for negotiation. I'm not negotiating that aspect. Victoria clarified. I'm suggesting that stable employment and housing might create conditions where reconciliation becomes possible, should you choose it. Mason studied her with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to assessing situations with engineering precision. You're very strategic, Ms. Harrington. As are you, Mr. Rivers, she counted. You've maintained your dignity and core principles despite circumstances that would break most people, that require strategy as much as strength. Something shifted in Mason's expression. A subtle recognition of being seen as an equal rather than a charity case. He extended his hand. I'll consider your proposal after medical clearance. No commitments yet, but genuine consideration. Victoria shook his hand, noting the calluses of decades of mechanical work alongside the strength that remained despite his illness. That's all I ask. The journey to Valley View Medical Center proceeded without incident. Mason was admitted for observation, and continued treatment with Charlie allowed to remain, after Eliza arranged for his certification as a service animal. The Harringtons returned to their cabin to pack for their return to Summerfield, the family subdued, as they processed the events of the past 48 hours. "This wasn't quite the weekend retreat I envisioned," Ethan commented, as they loaded the SUV that Hank had helped repair. Victoria glanced back at the cabin. Sometimes unplanned experiences yield the most valuable insights. Trevor, loading the final bag, paused. What if he refuses after all? Goes back to the Grove once he's recovered? That would be his choice. Victoria acknowledged, but I don't think he will. Why not? Trevor asked. Victoria closed the SUV's hatch decisively. Because beneath his circumstances, Mason Rivers is a builder, a creator. People like that need purpose. We're offering him a chance to reclaim that. Not just shelter. As they drove away from the cabin, Victoria's phone regained service, immediately buzzing with accumulated messages from Harrington Industries. She ignored them temporarily, instead conducting a search for Bradford Automotive Engineering, plus Mason Rivers. The results confirmed everything she had suspected. Articles in engineering journals, patent listings, photographs of a younger, clean-shaven Mason receiving awards for innovative designs. One image particularly caught her attention. Mason proudly standing beside a specialized vehicle, his arm around a teenage boy who shared his eyes and jawline. Jack Rivers, his son, now an architectural engineer in Denver. Victoria saved the search results, then opened her email and began composing a message to her human resources director about establishing a specialized restoration position. The wheels were already turning in her methodical mind, developing a framework that would become much more than just one man's redemption story. Back at Valley View Medical Center, Mason sat beside the window in his hospital room. Charlie curled at his feet. His fever had broken completely, and the antibiotics were steadily addressing the infection in his lungs. The physical improvement was undeniable, but greater still was the change occurring within his carefully protected emotional barriers. For the first time in years, Mason allowed himself to contemplate a future beyond day-to-day survival, to consider whether his self-imposed exile from normal life had protected his children or merely added to their pain. As he watched the mountains turning golden in the late afternoon sun, he made a quiet, tentative decision to open the door that Victoria Harrington had unexpectedly placed before him. Meanwhile, in Denver, a young architectural engineer named Jack Rivers received a surprising email from the CEO of Harrington Industries regarding his father, an email that would set in motion the second phase of this unexpected journey of redemption, reconnection, and renewed purpose. 2 weeks passed with remarkable swiftness. Mason progressed from hospital patient to outpatient, residing temporarily in a small apartment above Alpine Mechanics that Hank Wilson had insisted he used. During recovery, Charlie adapted contentedly to their improved circumstances, particularly enjoying the secure yard behind the shop where he could roam freely, while Mason worked on small projects to maintain his dexterity. Victoria Harrington had remained in regular contact, her approach consistently matter-of-fact. Rather than patronizing, she'd arranged for Mason to visit the vintage vehicle collection, housed in a specialized facility on the outskirts of Ridgewood, a visit that had rekindled something in his eyes that had been missing for years. "I hadn't realized Harrington Industries maintained something like this," Mason commented to Hank as they shared coffee in the small kitchen above the garage. 38 vehicles spanning nearly a century of automotive development, including prototypes that never reached production. Hank nodded. Started by Victoria's father. "From what I understand, company began manufacturing engine components back in the 1940s, before expanding to full industrial equipment." Mason's fingers traced the rim of his mug thoughtfully. The 1937 Pierce Arrow alone would take months to restore properly. The engine modifications were ingenious but severely compromised by improper maintenance. "So, you're considering her offer?" Hank asked, trying to sound casual despite his obvious hope. Mason stared into his coffee. "It's a legitimate position. The collection needs someone who understands evolving mechanical systems across decades, not just computerized diagnostics." "Perfect. Fit for your skills," Hank observed. "Perhaps," Mason acknowledged, "but there are complications. Your kids." Hank guessed. Mason looked up sharply. "What do you know about that?" Hank sighed, setting down his mug. "Jack called the shop yesterday, said he received An email from Victoria Harrington about you, a flash of something, anger, fear, perhaps both. Crossed Mason's face. She had no right. Maybe not, Hank conceded, but it's done. He's driving in from Denver tomorrow. Mason stood abruptly, his coffee forgotten. I'm not ready for that. When would you be ready? Hank challenged gently. Another 6 years, 10. Mason paced the small space, Charlie rising to follow him anxiously. You don't understand. I said things when Margaret died, when everything fell apart, unforgivable things. So apologize. Hank replied simply, it's not that easy. Never said. It was easy. Hank counted just necessary across town at the Ridgewood Inn. Eliza Harrington had extended her stay beyond the original weekend, taking remote work days to remain close to the situation her family had become unexpectedly invested in. Her professional experience with social services made her a natural liaison between Mason, the hospital, and the gradually forming support network. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, Jack. Rivers arriving tomorrow confirmed. Eliza felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Family reunifications were complex even under ideal circumstances after years of estrangement and trauma. This one carried significant emotional risk. Anything I should know about him? She texted back. Victoria's response was typically concise. 32, architectural engineer, married. One daughter, attempted reconciliation 2 years ago. Receptive to contact but realistic. Eliza considered this information. Jack Rivers had built a life while carrying the weight of his father's absence, an absence born not of abandonment, but of Mason's misguided attempt to spare his children from witnessing his decline. The psychology was heartbreakingly familiar from her casework with veterans suffering from PTSD and depression. Meanwhile, in Summerfield, Victoria sat in her home office reviewing the formal proposal for the restoration specialist position she'd created. The salary was competitive, the benefits comprehensive, and the schedule deliberately flexible to accommodate Mason's health considerations. Most critically, she'd structured it as a consulting role, initially allowing Mason to maintain independence while rebuilding his professional identity. Ethan entered with tea, placing a cup beside her. You've put more thought into this position than your last 3 executive hires. Victoria smiled faintly. Those executives came with proven track records and confidence. Mason requires a different approach. It's more than a business decision for you now, isn't it? Ethan observed. Victoria considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. It began as a practical solution to a wasteful situation, exceptional talent squandered by circumstance. But yes, it's evolved beyond that. Into what? She met her husband's gaze directly, a challenge to my own assumptions. I've always believed success is primarily determined by individual choices and effort. Mason's situation exposed the flaw in that thinking. That's a significant shift in worldview. Ethan noted, squeezing her shoulder gently. Perhaps overdue. Victoria acknowledged. Trevor seems to have made a similar adjustment. He's been researching veteran homelessness statistics for a paper he's writing. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Our son, who once called homeless people professional failure cases. The same, Victoria confirmed with a hint of pride, apparently meeting someone who holds 18 patents and can repair a luxury vehicle in a blizzard, challenged his assumptions about who becomes homeless and why. Their conversation was interrupted by Trevor himself, calling from his university apartment. Victoria put him on speaker. I've been thinking about Mason's housing situation. Trevor began without preamble. The apartment above Hank's garage is temporary, right? Yes, Victoria confirmed. Why? What about the groundskeepers, a cottage on the company retreat property? It's been empty since Mr. Patterson retired last. Your Victoria exchanged a surprised look with Ethan. The retreat property, 50 acres of woodland with a small lake and conference facility, sat just outside Ridgewood. The groundskeeper's cottage was a modest but well-maintained 2-bedroom structure that had indeed been vacant for months. That's actually quite brilliant. Victoria said it would allow privacy except Charlie and provide proximity to both the restoration facility and town. It would need some updating. Trevor continued, his voice animated by the idea. But it's structurally sound, and there's a workshop attached that could be modified for personal projects. When did you become so invested in this? Victoria asked, genuine curiosity in her voice, a brief hesitation after watching him fix our SUV in conditions that should have made it impossible. It made me realize how many assumptions I've made about people based on their current circumstances, rather than their capabilities or character. The following morning dawned clear and crisp. Mason rose early, his military habits reasserting themselves. As his health improved, he dressed carefully in clothes Eliza had helped him select from donations, simple but dignified attire that fit properly and showed respect for the occasion. Without pretension, Charlie sensed his anxiety staying closer than usual as Mason moved around the apartment, adjusting and readjusting the few possessions he'd salvaged from his collapsed shelter. "It'll be fine," he told the dog, though. His tone betrayed his uncertainty. Jack's a good man, always was, even as a teenager. A knock at the door sent Mason's heart racing, taking a deep breath. He opened it to find not Jack but Eliza Harrington mourning. She greeted him, noting his surprise hope. "I'm not interrupting, no," Mason replied, stepping back to admit her. "I was expecting." "Jack," Eliza finished, "he's at the cafe with my mother, wanted a briefing on your health status before seeing you." Mason's eyebrows rose. "Your mother is briefing my son." Eliza smiled. "Mom likes to manage variables before important meetings." "Occupational habit." She assessed him with a professional eye. "How are you feeling about this?" Mason appreciated her directness. "Terrified." He admitted, 6 years is a long time. Jack was newly married last time I saw him now. I hear he has a daughter I've never met." Lily, Eliza confirmed, she's 4. He brought photos. Mason turned away, emotion threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Charlie pressed against his leg, offering silent support. "I don't know what to say to him." Mason confessed quietly, how to explain what happened. Why I pushed them away. Eliza moved to stand beside him, her presence steadying rather than intrusive in my experience with family reunifications. Perfect words matter less than honest ones. Mason nodded, drawing a steadying breath. "I'm ready, or as ready as I'll ever be." They walked together to Mountain View Cafe. Charlie, trotting obediently alongside through the window. Mason could see Victoria sitting across from a man whose profile instantly tightened his chest with recognition and regret. Jack had grown a beard and responsibility had squared his shoulders, but his animated hand gestures while speaking remained unchanged from childhood. Mason hesitated at the door, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. Eliza touched his arm gently. "Just remember, he chose to come," she said softly. "That already says volumes." Inside, Jack looked up as the bell above the door announced their arrival. His conversation with Victoria halted mid-sentence as he stood, emotion flooding his features. "Dad," he said simply, his voice thick with restrained feeling. Mason stood frozen, all his carefully prepared words evaporating. "Jack?" Victoria rose smoothly. "We'll give you some privacy," she said, gesturing for Eliza to join her at a distant table. Father and son regarded each other across 6 years of absence, neither certain how to bridge the distance. "You look better than I expected," Jack finally said. "When Miss Harrington contacted me, I imagined worse." Mason supplied with a sad smile. "I was, until recently." Jack nodded, pain evident in his eyes. "I looked for you. 2 years ago, Hank said you'd moved on. I asked him to say that." Mason admitted, "I didn't want you to see me like that. That wasn't your decision to make." Jack replied, a flash of long-suppressed anger breaking through. "We're family through everything, not just the good parts." Mason sank into a chair, the weight of his son's words hitting harder than any physical blow. "You're right, I was wrong to push you and Emma away. I thought I was protecting you from watching me fall apart." "We could have helped," Jack said, sitting across from him instead. "We lost Mom. And then you." The raw honesty stripped away Mason's remaining defenses. "I'm sorry, Jack, more than I can ever express after your mother died. The PTSD I'd managed for years came roaring back. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. When Bradford let me go, it confirmed everything I feared, that I was broken, useless. You were grieving." Jack counted, "and sick, that doesn't make you useless." "I know that now," Mason acknowledged, "or I'm learning to know it." Perspective comes slowly. Sometimes Jack studied his father, taking in the weathered face, the still obvious effects of recent illness. but also the clear eyes and straight posture that suggested the core of the man remained intact. Miss Harrington says she's offering you a position restoring vintage vehicles. Mason nodded. The collection is remarkable, historically significant. It would be meaningful work. Are you going to accept? I'm considering it, Mason replied carefully. There are practical matters to resolve. Jack leaned forward intently. Dad, don't let pride stop you from rebuilding your life. That's what Mom would want. What we want, Mason asked. Hope and fear mingling in his voice. Emma knows I'm here. Jack confirmed she's cautious. You hurt her deeply when you refuse contact, but open to reconnection. If you're committed to recovery, Mason's gaze dropped to his hand-skilled hands that could disassemble and rebuild the most complex engines, but had failed to maintain his most precious connections. I'd like to meet my granddaughter, he said quietly. If that's possible someday. Jack's expression softened. Lily already knows about you. We've shown her pictures. She calls you Grandpa with the big machines because of that photo from the Barrett Engineering Award ceremony. The simple statement broke something open in Mason's carefully guarded heart. Charlie, sensing the shift in his master's emotions, pressed his head against Mason's knee in silent support. Is that your service dog? Jack asked, noting the interaction. Mason nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve from intense emotion. Charlie, he's been with me for years now. Literally saved my life more than once. Jack reached a tentative hand toward Charlie, who sniffed it curiously before allowing a brief pat. He's well-trained via a program. Mason explained one of the few things that worked out their conversation, gradually eased into less painful territory. Jack's work, designing sustainable buildings. His wife, Melissa's photography business, Little Lily's fascination with building things. Mason listened hungrily, absorbing details of the life that had continued without him across the cafe. Victoria and Eliza observed the reunion with respectful distance, both recognizing the significance of what was transpiring. Think they'll reconcile fully? Eliza asked softly. Victoria considered the body language between father and son, the initial tension now giving way to moments of tentative connection. Not instantly, but they've taken the critical first step. The rest depends on Mason accepting a sustainable path forward, like the restoration position and proper housing. Victoria nodded. And professional support for his PTSD. I've included comprehensive mental health coverage in the benefits package. Eliza studied her mother with newfound appreciation. He thought of everything? Not charity, Victoria clarified, echoing her consistent message: investment in recovered potential. Mason Rivers rebuilt, specialized military vehicles in active combat zones, and holds 18 patents. That expertise shouldn't be lost because life dealt him a devastating sequence of blows after an hour of conversation that had progressed from painfully awkward to cautiously hopeful. Jack and Mason rose to continue their reunion privately as they prepared to leave. Jack approached Victoria and Eliza's table. Thank you, he said simply, for reaching out, for seeing my father's value when others didn't. Victoria accepted his gratitude with a professional nod, though Eliza noticed a rare softening in her mother's usual businesslike demeanor. Your father is a remarkable man. His circumstances should never have defined him. Will you be extending your stay in Ridgewood? Eliza asked. A few days, Jack confirmed, long enough to understand the situation fully, and perhaps see this restoration facility everyone's talking about. As Jack and Mason departed with Charlie trotting between them. Walter Jenkins approached from behind the counter. Never thought I'd see the day, the cafe owner commented, refilling their coffee cups. Mason's been avoiding any mention of his family for years. Too painful. I guess sometimes people need an external catalyst to address internal wounds. Eliza observed, her social worker training evident in the assessment. Walter nodded thoughtfully. This whole town's been worried about him, especially this past winter. Coldest we've had in decades. Sheriff Davis found him nearly hypothermic back in January, but Mason refused the shelter again because of Charlie. The information added another layer to their understanding of Mason's precarious existence before their paths crossed. What do you think his chances are? Walter asked, nodding toward the door where Mason and Jack had exited, of really getting back on his feet. I mean, Victoria considered the question with her usual thoroughness, with proper support, appropriate employment, sustainable housing and family. Reconnection significant. The framework is forming. The rest depends on Mason's willingness to accept it, and if he doesn't, Walter pressed Victoria's expression remained resolute. Then we adjust the approach until we find one he will accept. I don't abandon viable projects. Mr. Jenkins, especially those with exceptional potential return. Later that afternoon, Victoria received a text from Mason, requesting a meeting to discuss the restoration position in specific terms. Her lips curved in a satisfied smile. The first milestone had been achieved across town. Mason and Jack walked along Ridgewood's main street, their conversation flowing more naturally now that the initial reunion hurdle had been crossed. "This cottage Miss Harrington mentioned," Jack said casually. "It sounds ideal for your situation, private but connected to the community." Mason glanced at his son, recognizing the gentle pressure being applied. "You approve of her proposal?" "Then I researched Harrington Industries after she contacted me," Jack replied. "They're known for employee retention and ethical practices. The restoration position leverages your best skills while accommodating health considerations." He shrugged. From an objective perspective, it's an exceptional opportunity. Mason stopped walking, turning to face his son directly. And from a son's perspective, Jack met his father's gaze steadily. "It's a chance to have you back in our lives in a meaningful way, for Lily to know her grandfather, for Emma to heal old wounds, for me to stop wondering if you're alive or dead each winter." His voice cracked slightly. "So yes, Dad, I approve. I more than approve. I'm asking you to accept it." The simple, heartfelt plea accomplished what no amount of logical argument could have achieved. Mason nodded slowly, decision crystallizing. "I'll need to review the terms," he said. "Engineer's precision asserting itself, ensure everything is properly defined." Jack smiled, recognizing the shift for what it was, his father's way of saying yes while maintaining his dignity and autonomy. "Of course," he agreed. "That's only sensible." As they resumed walking, Mason allowed himself to envision a future beyond day-to-day survival, one that included not just meaningful work and adequate shelter, but the family connections he had sacrificed in his misguided attempt to protect those he loved from his struggles. The restoration of Mason Rivers was beginning not just to functionality, but toward wholeness, and like the vintage vehicles he would soon resurrect, the process would require patience, expertise, and the acknowledgement that broken things of value deserve the effort needed to make them whole again. 3 months transformed the groundskeeper's cottage beyond recognition. What had been a serviceable but dated residence became a carefully restored home that reflected both Mason's practical nature and his renewed sense of purpose. The wooden floors had been sanded and refinished by hand, kitchen cabinets rebuilt rather than replaced, each improvement bearing the mark of someone who understood that restoration meant honoring original craftsmanship while addressing functional needs. Most significant was the transformation of the attached workshop. With Victoria's approval and modest company funding, Mason had converted the space into a specialized restoration laboratory, where he could solve the most challenging mechanical problems from the vintage collection. Specialized tools hung in precise organization on pegboards, manuals, and technical documents filled custom shelves. A dedicated workbench accommodated Charlie's bed nearby, allowing the loyal dog to remain close while Mason worked on this particular morning. Mason stood in this workshop examining the disassembled carburetor from a 1941 Packard. His focus absolute as he identified the source of its persistent flooding issue at 62. His hands remained steady, his diagnostic instincts sharp. The months of proper nutrition, medical care, and meaningful work had restored not just his health but a dignity evident in his bearing. A knock at the workshop door broke his concentration. He looked up to find Victoria Harrington standing in the doorway, dressed in her usual business attire. "Despite the weekend progress?" she inquired, nodding toward the disassembled components identified. "The issue," Mason replied, gesturing for her to enter. "Float valve was modified incorrectly during a previous restoration attempt. Whoever did it understood the symptom, but not the system." Victoria smiled slightly at his assessment, one that so perfectly articulated his unique value to the collection. "Can it be corrected already?" "Machining the replacement part," Mason confirmed. "Should have the Packard running properly by Wednesday." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Excellent. The board members will be impressed when they tour the collection next month." Mason wiped his hands on a shop towel, studying his employer with the same precision he applied to mechanical systems. I doubted you came out here on Saturday morning to check on a carburetor repair perceptive. As always, Victoria acknowledged. I actually came to discuss an expansion of your role. Mason raised an eyebrow. Inviting her to continue the success of your work on the collection has exceeded expectations. Victoria explained 8 vehicles fully operational that previous restorers couldn't properly diagnose. Your documentation of the restoration processes has been exemplary. I appreciate the recognition, Mason said carefully, but I sense there's more. Victoria produced a tablet from her briefcase and handed it to him. This is a proposal for a hands-on technical training program, using the restoration facility as a teaching environment. Mason scrolled through the document, his expression shifting from curiosity to thoughtful consideration. As he absorbed the details. You want me to teach, he said, finally looking up. I want you to share your expertise with select candidates who could benefit from it, Victoria clarified. Particularly veterans struggling with transition to civilian employment. The proposal outlined a structured program where participants would learn both fundamental mechanical principles and specialized restoration techniques through direct apprenticeship. The Harrington Foundation would provide funding with Ridgewood, veterans all serving as the recruiting partner. Mason set the tablet down carefully. This is unexpected, is it? Victoria challenged mildly. You've informally mentored 3 of our maintenance staff already. They specifically sought your guidance on the factory equipment overhaul last month. Mason couldn't deny this observation. His natural teaching ability had emerged organically, as staff recognized his exceptional knowledge. I'm not sure I'm qualified for formal instruction, he said, though, without immediate rejection of the concept. Your military record indicates otherwise. Victoria counted as Master Sergeant. You trained dozens of specialists in field repair techniques. Your performance evaluations consistently praised your instructional capabilities. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been researching my service record due diligence, Victoria replied unapologetically before proposing a significant program expansion. Charlie padded over from his bed, sensing the shift in his master's energy. Mason absently stroked the dog's head while considering Victoria's proposal. Why veterans specifically? He asked. Multiple reasons. Victoria answered. First, their existing mechanical training provides a foundation. Second, they understand discipline and process adherence. Third, she paused, her typically businesslike demeanor softening slightly. Your journey demonstrated that technical skill and personal value don't disappear with circumstances. That lesson has particular relevance for veterans facing transition challenges. Mason recognized the subtle reference to his own struggles and how they informed this proposal rather than feeling exploited. He appreciated Victoria's characteristic directness. I'd need to consider the logistics carefully, he said. Neither accepting nor rejecting outright teaching requires different resources than direct restoration work. Of course, Victoria agreed. Review the proposal thoroughly. We can discuss modifications. Next week, as she turned to leave, Mason called after her. This wasn't in my original position description. Victoria paused at the door. Neither was rebuilding the antique radio for Mrs. Patterson at the hospital or repairing Walter's refrigerator at the cafe or the dozen other community projects you've undertaken while still exceeding expectations on your official duties. A rare smile crossed her face. Some capabilities emerged through application, rather than job descriptions. After Victoria departed, Mason sank onto his workshop stool, the carburetor temporarily forgotten as he contemplated this unexpected proposition. Charlie rested his chin on Mason's knee, offering silent companionship. What do you think, boy? Mason murmured. Me? Teaching again after all these years? His phone buzzed with a text from Jack Lily's school project working perfectly. After your suggestions, she's telling everyone her grandpa is a mechanical wizard. Video call tomorrow, at 10. Mason smiled, sending quick confirmation. These regular communications with his son had become anchoring points in his week. Through them, he was gradually rebuilding the relationship he'd nearly destroyed through misguided pride and unchecked PTSD. Emma remained more cautious in her reconnection. But even she had progressed to direct phone calls every few weeks. The text message crystallized something in Mason's thinking about Victoria's proposal. His technical knowledge had value beyond the specific vehicles. He restored it could be transmitted multiplied through others who face challenges similar to his own. Across town at Ridgewood Veterans Hall, Sheriff Davis was meeting with a recently discharged Marine Corps mechanic named Michael Torres. At 38, Torres possessed both technical skill and combat experience, but his transition to civilian employment had been rocky at best. "I don't need another job fair or resume a workshop," Torres said with barely concealed frustration. "I need someone to recognize that maintaining equipment under enemy fire translates to valuable skills." Sheriff Davis nodded. "Understanding, actually. I might have something different." New program being developed locally, focused on veterans with mechanical aptitude. Torres's expression remained skeptical. "What kind of program? Restoration, apprenticeship technical training with practical application," the sheriff explained. "Run by someone who understands both military experience and civilian transition challenges. Sounds too good to be true," Torres replied wearily. "What's the catch?" "No catch." Sheriff Davis assured him. "Just careful selection of candidates." The instructor was a master sergeant. Cause of engineers, faced his own rocky transition. Now he's rebuilding vintage vehicles that stumped professional restorers for years. A flicker of genuine interest crossed Torres's face. "When would this start?" "Still in development," the sheriff admitted. "But I can put your name on the interest list," as Torres provided his contact information. His wife Rebecca watched with cautious hope. Since his discharge 8 months earlier, she'd witnessed his growing frustration with civilian employers who failed to recognize his transferable skills or understand his occasional need for accommodation. When PTSD symptoms flared, "You think this could be different?" she asked as they left the Veterans Hall. "Not just another false start?" Michael shrugged, unwilling to invest too much hope after multiple disappointments. "Maybe," the sheriff mentioned. "The instructor had his own transition issues. That's different." At least back at the cottage, Mason spent the remainder of the day dividing his attention between the Packard's carburetor and Victoria's proposal. By evening, he'd solved both problems, identifying the precise metal alloy needed for the float valve replacement and outlining modifications to the teaching program that would make it both practical and impactful. As spring warmth settled over Ridgewood, news of the proposed veteran training program spread through carefully managed channels. At Harrington Industries headquarters in Summerfield, Victoria presented the concept to her executive team, framing it as both a community investment and a specialized workforce development initiative. The restoration facility has already proven its value in preserving historically significant vehicles. She explained this expansion leverages that investment while addressing a community need. Aaron Brooks, head of special projects, raised his hand. "Veterans specifically, is that a practical limitation or a philosophical choice?" Both, Victoria answered frankly. "Military technical training provides a solid foundation for the specialized work. Additionally, the instructor's background makes him uniquely qualified to understand the transition challenges these candidates face." Mason Rivers, Aaron stated, rather than ask the engineer you recruited from unusual circumstances. Victoria met his gaze directly. Yes, his results speak for themselves. 8 fully operational vehicles that previous restoration teams declared beyond repair. Complete documentation of processes for future reference, technical innovations that solve problems others couldn't identify. The presentation continued with projected costs, expected outcomes, and community impact metrics. Victoria's thoroughness leaving no question unrest when unanimous approval came. She accepted it with characteristic composure, though those who knew her well could detect her particular satisfaction with this project. Trevor, who had insisted on attending despite his university commitments, caught up with his mother afterwards. "Congratulations," he said, falling into step beside her. "They didn't stand a chance against that presentation." Victoria allowed a small smile. "The merits were clear. The board appreciates measurable returns on investment, both financial and social." Trevor noted, "That's new for Harrington Industries. Evolution, not revolution." Victoria corrected, "Your grandfather understood community investment. We simply formalized the approach." Trevor grinned, and it only took one homeless veteran mechanic to catalyze it. Victoria gave her son a measured look. Sometimes the right case study illuminates larger principles. Speaking of Mason, Trevor continued, "I'm heading to Ridgewood this weekend. Thought I'd stop by the cottage, see the workshop modifications." Victoria nodded approval. He'd appreciate that he mentioned You've been exchanging ideas about the 1956 Continental's electrical system. Trevor's expression brightened. He actually implemented my suggestion for the voltage regulator workaround. Said it was elegant. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Victoria studied her son, the business student who once dismissed homeless people as personal failures, now eagerly collaborating with Mason on technical challenges. The transformation went beyond mere tolerance to genuine respect and friendship. Your perspective has shifted considerably since our cabin weekend. She observed. Trevor considered this. I guess I needed to see beyond circumstances to the actual person Mason could be, running an engineering department or teaching at MIT. If life had dealt him different cards and now he'll be teaching veterans. Instead. Victoria noted, perhaps with greater impact the following day. Mason welcomed Jack and his family to the cottage. For their first in-person visit since his relocation to Ridgewood, the moment held both significance and anxiety. His son seeing tangible evidence of his rebuilding process and his first meeting with granddaughter Lily, the initial awkwardness dissolved. Almost immediately when 4-year-old Lily spotted Charlie and exclaimed in delight. The well-trained dog looked to Mason for permission, before gently accepting the child's attention, his tail wagging slowly as she stroked his fur with careful. "Hens, you have a house now," Lily announced to Mason with a child's direct observation. "Daddy said you didn't before." Jack tensed slightly, but Mason handled the comment with simple honesty. "That's right, eh? Didn't for a while, but now I do, and there's even a special room for when my granddaughter visits." Lily's eyes widened. "Me? Unless I have another granddaughter. I don't know about." Mason replied with a wink. Jack's wife Melissa, initially cautious about this reunion, relaxed visibly as she observed Mason's interaction with Lily, gentle, patient, present, in a way that spoke of emotional health, rather than the unstable, grief-stricken man Jack had described from their last encounter years earlier. After lunch, Jack joined Mason in the workshop, while Melissa and Lily explored the garden where Mason had begun planting vegetables in raised beds constructed from repurposed lumber. "This is impressive," Jack said, examining the organized space with an engineer's appreciation. "You've created a real laboratory here." Mason nodded. Satisfaction evident. Being able to dissect problems properly makes all the difference. The collection had good maintenance but poor restoration. People replacing symptoms instead of understanding systems. Jack picked up a custom tool from the workbench. "You're making your own tools again. Some problems require specific solutions." Mason replied, the philosophy extending beyond mechanics. "Mom used to say that about your workshop at home." Jack recalled that you could build anything if you had enough time and the right tools. The mention of Margaret brought a moment of shared remembrance, rather than the sharp pain that had once accompanied her memory. She was right about most things, Mason acknowledged softly. Jack set the tool down carefully. "Mrs. Harrington mentioned a teaching program. Veterans with mechanical aptitude. News travels fast," Mason observed dryly. "Is it something you're considering?" "Seriously?" Jack asked. Mason leaned against the workbench. "I am. It's outside my comfort zone. But that's not necessarily a negative. You were always a good teacher." Jack said, patient, thorough. "I learned more about mechanical systems from you by age 12 than most engineering students learn in college." The simple validation from his son carried more weight than Victoria's formal proposal or the board's approval. Mason nodded decision. "Solidifying first candidate interviews next month," he said. "Small group initially, 5 veterans with appropriate background." Jack smiled. "They're fortunate to have you as an instructor. We'll see about that." Mason replied, though without his former self-deprecation. Through the window they could see Lily helping Melissa plant seedlings in the garden beds, the child's face alight with concentrated effort. The simple domesticity of the scene struck both men with its normally a stark contrast to the years of estrangement and struggle. "I never thought we'd be here," Jack admitted quietly. "When I got Ms. Harrington's email, I was prepared to find you in much worse circumstances or not find you at all." Mason met his son's gaze directly. "I'm sorry for the years we lost, for pushing you and Emma away when I should have held on tighter. You're here now," Jack said simply. "Building something new, that's what matters." As evening approached and Jack's family prepared to depart, Lily presented Mason with a drawing she'd created, a somewhat abstract representation of Charlie, beside what appeared to be a large car. "It's you fixing the big car in the special room," she explained seriously. Daddy says you make broken things work again. Mason knelt to accept the gift, his voice rough with emotion. That's right. Sometimes broken things just need someone to understand how they're supposed to work. Jack and Melissa exchanged glances, both recognizing the deeper meaning in Mason's words, how his own broken life had needed the right combination of opportunity and understanding to begin functioning properly again after they departed. Mason placed Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, securing it with a magnet Victoria had given him that bore the Harrington Industries logo. The juxtaposition of these elements, his granddaughter's artwork, and the corporate emblem, symbolized the interconnected factors that had facilitated his reconstruction. Later that evening, Mason sat on his small porch with Charlie at his feet, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. His phone contained a newly confirmed schedule for the Veterans Training Program JAX, photos from their visit, and a tentative message from Emma suggesting she might visit in the coming months. The contrast with his life just 6 months earlier was stark beyond measurement, from struggling for day-to-day survival in the Grove to sitting on the porch of a home where his family could visit, where his skills were valued, where his experience, even the painful parts, could provide pathways for others facing similar challenges. As darkness settled over Ridgewood, Mason recognized that his restoration was ongoing, like the vintage vehicles he repaired. Some systems still needed adjustment, some connections required strengthening, but the foundation was sound, the essential components functioning as designed. The work would continue, more intricate in some areas than others, but proceeding with purpose and care, rather than desperate improvisation. The evening air carried the scent of approaching rain as Mason rose to go inside Charlie, following faithfully behind them. The workshop, where broken mechanical systems found new life, stood ready for tomorrow's challenges ahead. The lighted windows of the cottage beckoned with a promise. Once thought irretrievably lost the simple security of having somewhere to belong 1 year from. The night of the blizzard, Ridgewood's community center buzzed with unusual activity. The typically modest building had been transformed for the evening. Vintage vehicles displayed on the main floor, photographs documenting restoration processes lining the walls, and at the center, 5 proud graduates in matching navy blue work shirts embroidered with Harrington Veterans Restoration Program. Mason Rivers stood slightly apart from the gathering crowd, watching with quiet satisfaction as Michael Torres demonstrated the functioning of a 1949 Ford pickup's completely rebuilt engine to an impressed group of town officials. The Marine veteran's technical explanation was confident and precise, a far cry from the frustrated, directionless man who had first arrived at the program 8 months earlier. "You've done remarkable work here," Victoria Harrington said, appearing beside Mason with 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She handed him one. "The board is exceptionally pleased with the outcomes." Mason accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. "The candidates did the work. I just provided guidance. False modesty doesn't suit you," Victoria replied with characteristic directness. These men arrived with technical aptitude but lacked focus and confidence. Now they're certified restoration specialists with employment offers. Mason couldn't deny the transformation beyond Michael Torres. The graduating class included Carlos Ramirez, a former Army mechanic who'd struggled with civilian employment for 3 years, Timothy Watson, a Vietnam-era veteran who'd been homeless longer than Mason himself, and 2 younger veterans whose transition from military structure had left them adrift. Despite marketable skills, they had the capacity all along, Mason maintained. They just needed someone who understood both the mechanical systems and the obstacles they faced. "Precisely why you were the ideal instructor," Victoria noted. "You provided something no standard training program could: authentic understanding of their challenges." Across the room, Trevor was engaged in animated conversation with Carlos about the electrical system adaptation they'd developed for the 1937 Pierce Arrow, a genuine friendship that had formed through shared problem-solving rather than forced interaction. Eliza chatted with the veterans' families, her professional interest in the program's success balanced by personal investment in its participants. "The Harrington family has embraced this project completely," Mason observed. Victoria followed his gaze to her children. "They found meaning in it beyond what I anticipated, especially Trevor. He has good mechanical instincts," Mason acknowledged. "Sees connections. Others miss a quality you've encouraged." Victoria noted his professors. report a significant improvement in his analytical approaches this year. Mason shifted slightly, still uncomfortable with direct praise despite months of progress. The next class has 8 candidates, he said, changing the subject too many for the current workshop space already addressed. Victoria replied, the board approved expansion funding yesterday. Construction begins next month. The ease with which obstacles disappeared under Victoria's methodical planning still occasionally surprised Mason, though he'd grown accustomed to her efficiency over their months of collaboration. Sheriff Davis approached, shaking Mason's hand warmly. Quite a different scene from last winter, he commented, the reference to Mason's former circumstances made. Without awkwardness, Governor's office is sending a representative next week to learn about the program they're interested in. Potential statewide implementation. Mason raised an eyebrow. I wasn't informed, just confirmed this afternoon. The sheriff explained they're particularly interested in the employment outcomes. All 5 graduates with immediate placement is unprecedented for veteran transition programs. Victoria's expression remained neutral. Though Mason detected her satisfaction, the program's success metrics exceeded even her carefully calculated projections, validating her instinct about combining Mason's expertise with structured opportunity for struggling veterans. As the evening progressed, Mason found himself increasingly the center of attention, a position that once would have triggered his withdrawal. Now he handled it with quiet dignity, deflecting personal praise toward the graduates' accomplishments. While acknowledging the program's structured approach, Mayor Collins presented each graduate with an official certificate, his speech emphasizing community partnership and second chances, when he specifically thanked Mason as the program's heart and soul. The sustained applause prompted a rare moment of visible emotion from the normally reserved instructor. Later, as the formal presentations concluded and guests mingled around the restored vehicles, Emma Rivers approached her father at 35. She carried herself with the composed presence of the elementary school teacher. She had become her resemblance to Margaret, sometimes catching Mason unprepared. The blue pine workbench was Dad's, she said, nodding toward the photographic display showing Mason's workshop evolution. I recognized it immediately. Mason nodded, touched that she'd noticed this detail. Your mother insisted I take it when we moved from Michigan, said good craftsmanship shouldn't be discarded. She was right. Emma replied softly. About many things, their reconciliation had progressed more gradually than Mason's reunion with Jack, understandable. Given Emma had been closer to Margaret and taken her death particularly hard, her visits remained less frequent, her forgiveness more measured, but the steady improvement in their relationship represented perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Mason's restored life. Lily's been showing everyone at her kindergarten pictures of Grandpa's special cars. Emma continued. With a hint of a smile, her teacher was quite impressed when she explained carburetor function to the class. Mason chuckled. Jack mentioned she's been spending time in his home workshop following family tradition. Emma noted, though, Mom would say, we got the mechanical gene from you. The casual reference to family traits. The acknowledgement of continuity. Despite the years of separation, warmed Mason more deeply than the formal accolades of the evening. Colonel James Blackwood, Mason's former commanding officer who had traveled from Washington for the graduation, joined them with a glass of punch in hand. Rivers, he greeted with military brevity, your program documentation is impressive. Pentagon's reviewing it for potential adaptation at transition centers. Mason straightened slightly in the presence of his former superior. The framework is replicable. With the right instructors, that's the challenge, Blackwood replied frankly. Finding people with both technical expertise and personal experience with transition obstacles. He glanced meaningfully around the room. What you've built here is unique, precisely because of your journey. Emma watched this exchange with interest, seeing her father through the lens of his military identity, a perspective that added dimension to her understanding of his struggles and eventual recovery. The candidates are the key variable, Mason explained. Selection criteria. Prioritize aptitude and commitment over perfect histories. Most transition programs do the opposite. Blackwood nodded approval, starting with capability rather than deficiency sensible approach. As the colonel moved on to speak with Victoria, Emma touched her father's arm lightly. He respects you, she observed. We served together during difficult deployments, Mason replied. Builds a certain understanding. It's more than that. Emma countered perceptively. He sees what you've accomplished here as an extension of your military service, finding solutions to complex problems with limited resources. Mason considered this interpretation. Perhaps, though, this mission has more personal significance. Emma's expression softened. Because of what you went through, because of what these men are facing. Mason corrected gently the gap between their capabilities and civilian recognition of their value. Emma studied her father. The straight posture, clear eyes, and measured speech so different from the broken, angry man who had pushed her away after her mother's death. The transformation went beyond physical recovery or employment stability to something more fundamental. A reclamation of purpose that honored, rather than rejected, his difficult path. Mom would be proud, she said simply. Mason's composure wavered briefly before he steadied himself. I hope so. Across the room, Hank Wilson was enthusiastically explaining to Trevor and several town officials how the restoration program had affected his business. 2 of my best current employees came through Mason's training. The garage owner reported they understand systems thinking, not just parts replacement changes, the whole approach to repairs. Victoria, overhearing this testimonial, filed it away as another measurable community impact for her next board presentation. The program's success extended beyond the direct participants to ripple through local businesses and services. Exactly the outcome she had projected, but with even stronger results. As the evening drew to a close, Mason found himself standing beside the 1937 Pierce Arrow, the first vehicle he had fully restored for the Harrington collection, and now the centerpiece of the graduation display. Its gleaming midnight blue finish reflected the overhead lights, the handcrafted wooden dashboard restored to original luster, every mechanical system functioning with precision that matched factory specifications. Beautiful work. Walter Jenkins commented, joining Mason in admiration of the vehicle. Hard to believe this was considered beyond repair a year ago. Most things labeled beyond repair simply haven't found the right approach yet. Mason replied, the philosophy extending well beyond music automobiles. Walter nodded toward where Michael Torres was saying goodbye to guests with newfound confidence. Like that young man when he first came to town, he was angry at everything. Couldn't hold a job, now he's fielding multiple employment offers. He needed the right context. Mason explained his skills were always exceptional, but conventional workplaces couldn't accommodate his transition challenges. Sounds familiar, Walter observed with friendly directness. Mason acknowledged the parallel with a slight smile. Teaching from experience has certain advantages. As the community center gradually emptied, Mason found himself in conversation with the Harrington family near the Pierce Arrow. The year that had passed since their chance encounter on Eagle's Bend had transformed them all in ways none could have anticipated that night. We should commemorate this anniversary properly, Ethan suggested. Perhaps dinner at the cabin this weekend. Victoria consulted her ever-present calendar. The board meeting concludes Friday afternoon. Saturday would be feasible. I could drive a Friday evening to prepare. Eliza offered. Trevor grinned. I'll bring the emergency repair kit just in case. The gentle teasing about their initial meeting had become familiar. The formerly awkward memory now transformed into a foundational story they all shared. Mason, Victoria prompted, will that work with your schedule? He nodded, still occasionally surprised to be included in family plans. Despite the months of evolving connection, Charlie and I can make it. The new class doesn't begin until the following week. As they finalized details, Mason realized how seamlessly his life had interwoven with theirs, not through dependency or charity, but through mutual respect and shared purpose that had developed organically from crisis to collaboration to genuine relationship. Later that night, Mason walked with Charlie through the quiet streets of Ridgewood toward his cottage. The spring air carried the scent of flowering trees, so different from the bitter cold of the previous year. Sheriff Davis passed, in his patrol car, offering a friendly wave, rather than the concerned vigilance that had once characterized his encounters with Mason at the cottage. Mason found a package on his porch, a carefully wrapped gift with Emma's handwriting on the card. Inside was a framed photograph he hadn't seen in years. Mason, in his army dress uniform, standing proudly beside Margaret at his promotion ceremony. Jack and Emma as teenagers flanking their parents, their young faces reflecting pride in their fathers. Accomplishment. The note read simply, to remember where you've been and how far you've come. With love. Emma. Mason placed the photograph carefully on his mantelpiece, the image of his younger self in uniform, striking in its confidence and purpose. qualities he had lost and painfully reclaimed through an unexpected journey of fall and restoration. In the workshop behind the cottage, the tools lay ready for the next day's challenges. On the desk, applications for the incoming class awaited his review. 8 veterans, whose backgrounds reflected the same mixture of technical skill and personal struggle that had characterized his own path. Their files contained the formal details of their military service and subsequent difficulties. But Mason knew the most important elements wouldn't appear in documentation: the resilience, adaptability, and fundamental worth that persisted despite circumstances. As he prepared for bed, Mason paused at the window overlooking the property that had become his home in the distance. Lights from Ridgewood twinkled against the mountain backdrop. The community that had first known him as a homeless veteran, now recognizing him as a valued instructor, restoration specialist, and citizen. The transformation had not been instantaneous, or without setbacks. His PTSD still required management, some days better than others. The grief for Margaret remained, though it had evolved from debilitating to bittersweet. But the essential difference was purpose, not just survival, but contribution, that leveraged rather than denied his difficult journey. Charlie settled on his bed near Mason's, the loyal companion, who had witnessed every step of his recovery as Mason turned out the light. His thoughts drifted to the graduates who had completed the program today, each carrying forward technical skills and renewed confidence into lives that held possibilities unimaginable. Months earlier, this perhaps was the most profound restoration of all, not just of vintage vehicles, or even of his own life, but the ongoing process of helping others reclaim capabilities obscured by circumstance, like the vehicles in the Harrington collection. These men possessed intrinsic value and purpose that required only the right combination of opportunity, expertise, and patient attention to function as designed. In the morning, Mason would review applications for the next class, continue work on the challenging transmission rebuild for the 1952 Bentley, and speak with Jack about Lily's upcoming visit. Normal activities in a life that had stabilized around meaningful work, family reconciliation, and community connection, elements that had once seemed irretrievably lost during those desperate years in the Grove. The journey had begun with a stranded family in a blizzard and a homeless veteran who retained his expertise despite losing nearly everything else. It continued now, through lives touched directly and indirectly by the chain of events set in motion. That night, a widening circle of impact that would extend far beyond what any of them could have imagined during their first encounter on Eagle's Bend. As Mason drifted towards sleep, the words he often shared with his veterans class echoed in his mind. Words that encompassed both mechanical systems and human lives. Understanding the fundamental design reveals the path to restoration. Every component has purpose. Nothing of value is truly beyond repair. Outside his window, the mountains stood as they had for millennia, bearing witness to the small but significant transformations occurring in their shadow lives. Rebuilt, connections restored, and value recognized. Beyond the deceptive surface of circumstance in Ridgewood, a community had learned to see potential. Where once they had seen only problems, at Harrington Industries, a company had expanded its definition of investment and return. And in a modest cottage that had once seemed an impossible dream, Mason Rivers had found not just shelter, but home. The story that began with a desperate rescue on a mountain pass had evolved into something none of its participants could have predicted. A testament to the fact that sometimes our most profound expertise emerges not despite our darkest challenges, but because of the wisdom and compassion forged within them. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a